Well, thank you. It's a delight to be here with you all here at ACU for Justice Week and to be associated with organizations like American Enterprise Institute and the International Justice Mission. I want to thank the committee for assigning me such an easy topic as religion and politics. And the last time I spoke was at an event in which there was a series on relationships, and everyone else who was speaking got to talk about marriage and dating, and I got assigned the topic of celibacy. And so I don't know how I keep drawing the short straw here, but here we go. I know that this week you're going to be talking about policy solutions to issues of poverty. And as someone who's worked on this both in England and in the United States, I am not without opinions about these, but I know we'll have opportunity to talk about that with some groups later today. This morning, what I want to do is actually take a step back from specific policy debates and ask how Christians might approach these questions, specifically as Christians. So as Madeline mentioned, I'm part of an Anglican church on Capitol Hill in Washington, and many members of our congregation work in politics, and we have folks that work on both sides of the aisle. And so last year for our annual church retreat, we printed up a selection of letters that were written anonymously by members of the congregation to describe their experience as a Christian in D.C., and specifically a Christian who works in politics. One letter came from a person who works with Democrats, and she does so because she's deeply committed to addressing issues of poverty, and her letter described her ongoing discouragement at the frequency with which the genuineness of her faith was questioned by other Christians because she's a Democrat. Another letter came from a church member who works in the White House for President Trump. And she described the vitriol she experienced from other Christians when they learned that she works in the current administration. Both work in their respective roles because their understanding of what leads to a more flourishing society has led them to work in different political circles. Neither of them do so naively or uncritically or accept wholesale every policy that their side promotes. But their letters, which were read aloud during the retreat, raise some important questions. Why do our political identities today seem more decisive than almost any other aspect of our identities? Why does the Christian community appear to exhibit the very same degree of antagonism and polarization that exists in the broader community? And perhaps most fundamentally, a question that I would like for us to consider briefly here this morning: is there anything distinctive about how Christians should engage in politics? And if so, what would that look like? Now, because we are considering this question at an institution like ACU, I'm going to make a few assumptions. The first assumption is that politics is more than simply who you vote for. Politics is a comprehensive process in which people with different views seek the common good together, and because Christianity is concerned with human flourishing, Christianity is inescapably political. The second assumption I'm going to make is that the gospel Jesus preached is not a privatized Jesus and me get saved so I can go to heaven when I die kind of gospel. We will take it as assumed that the death and resurrection of Jesus signaled the inbreaking of God's reign into the world, and therefore that God's vision for the world should find expression today in everything from art to architecture to journalism to business and also to politics. My third assumption is this, however: God's kingdom is not fully here. It's broken in, it's in motion, but it's not fully arrived. Jesus has not returned in person to rule. And therefore, God orders and affirms earthly caretaker governments to enact justice that is provisional and partial and temporary. Earthly governments are not Christian, nor can they be. Triumphal attempts to make earthly regimes in any way directly identified with God's rule is a political and a theological mistake. But if we acknowledge a necessary gap between God's kingdom and earthly politics, we then have to ask, what can we expect of earthly politics? How do we translate a kingdom vision into the messiness of politics today? There are a lot of ways that we could answer that, but the theologian Karl Barth argued that we work towards governments that are analogous to God's kingdom, governments that resemble God's kingdom, if only in a distant way. The laws that we pass regarding human trafficking or poverty or the family have the possibility for bringing societies into degrees of relative alignment with God's kingdom. But this means that Christians engage in politics aware of a deep tension, a tension that is constant and inescapable. We put our best efforts towards creating the political conditions that lead to human flourishing, even as we remember the complexities of the issues and the limitations of our understanding, and the reminder that even the best political achievements are highly fragile until Christ returns. So, in light of these tensions, then, how might Christians move forward to seek to translate God's kingdom into the messiness of earthly politics? And I want to suggest three things briefly. First, I want to suggest that we start by becoming more deeply formed by the liturgy of the church instead of the liturgy of the state. Now, in the church tradition that I grew up in, we thought of ourselves as non-liturgical. But the reality is that all churches have liturgies, whether they call them that or not, because liturgies are simply rituals and ceremonies that groups perform on a regular basis. Some churches have very elaborate liturgies with incense and vestments, and others have more simple liturgies in the way that they sing hymns or take communion. But every church has certain things that they do and ways that they do it each and every week that express and shape who they are. And I'm suggesting that we allow the liturgies of the church to shape us politically, because if we don't, the liturgies of the state will. Because the reality is that liturgy and politics always go together. Nation states use liturgy to build cohesion and to shape the desires of its citizens, and the United States is no exception. So think about it. We have liturgies that begin shaping citizens from a very young age. We take young children and we have them start the school day by putting their hands over their hearts and pledging allegiance to America as represented by the flag. Anytime we get large groups of people together in stadiums for sporting events, we start liturgically by singing about America. I remember I had a friend visiting from England. We were at a Nationals baseball game in D.C., and we stood up at the beginning to sing the national anthem. And he stood up and he said, Are we doing this right now? I said, yes. He said, you don't do this just at the Olympics? I said, oh no. We do this for every single sporting event in every city, in every small town across America, every day. He said, you Americans are hardcore. Every spring, my city, Washington, D.C., is flooded with yellow school buses, out of which pour 8th graders from across the country who have been brought on a pilgrimage to the nation's capital. They will gaze at saint-like statues of the founding fathers. They will hear about agreements that occurred like miracles at the Constitutional Convention. They will climb the steps of the Lincoln Memorial, a structure that was intentionally designed to look and feel like a temple. And they will gaze in silent contemplation at our martyred president and read his words engraved on the stone walls. Now, my intent here is not to make a critique, but simply to highlight that politics and liturgy always go together. A political vision always relies on liturgy to shape people's desires, ultimately hoping that you will love something enough to die for it. But if it is sometimes easy to miss the liturgy that is embedded in the state's politics, it can also be easy to miss the politics that are embedded in the church's liturgy. So let's think about what happens when you come to church on Sunday. First of all, you have to get up and get dressed and come down to a public gathering. Why do we do this? Why don't we just stay at home and listen to a podcast sermon or watch a live streaming service on the internet? Perhaps we should ask that of the people who come to Washington, D.C. to gather on the National Mall for political rallies. Why do they make all that effort? Why don't they just stay at home and post things on Facebook? Because gathering together makes a public statement. It is an act of witness. And so with church, simply showing up to gather with other Christians is a weekly public witness. After Christians have arrived at church, later in the service, in most traditions, they will take communion, reenacting a meal that Jesus had with his disciples. It's a ritualistic meal, but it's a real meal with real food and real drink. But the communion meal is different from the meals that occur in daily life out in the world. Out in the world, some people go to expensive restaurants, some people go to inexpensive restaurants, and others cannot afford to go to restaurants at all. And in general, these groups do not share fellowship together over a meal. But every Sunday, Christians come to a table in which Jesus is the host, and which we are told is a foretaste of the meals that humanity will enjoy in the age to come. And as we come up, regardless of class or background or race or income, we stand or kneel in exactly the same posture, bringing nothing apart from outstretched hands to receive. And we might ask, what are the political or social or economic implications of communion? And if we want the world to at least partially reflect the goodness of God's kingdom, how might we extend what is happening at communion to our neighborhoods and our cities? Now, making these kinds of connections will require creativity and wisdom and prudence, and we may find that certain Christian concerns don't have any obvious political traction. We may find that the perspectives that emerge do not always line up neatly with party politics as they are currently conceived. We may find that there is not simply one answer. But because it's not easy, we need to do more than simply allow ourselves to be shaped by the church's liturgy. And therefore, my second suggestion is that we seek to talk about issues of justice with other Christians, including and even especially with those with whom we disagree politically. Now, this may be difficult, and we will need to proceed with great care and with love and humility, and it may be that the Thanksgiving dinner table is not the best time to launch this experiment. We'll need to learn to communicate our views with gentleness and be open to being wrong. But the world is actually, and I can tell you in Washington, D.C., the world is looking for models of how to do this. Christians ought to be able to have better conversations about politics and justice than the rest of the world. The final consideration is this: we should seek to ground our broader political reflections on local, hands-on involvement. The church should always seek to be incarnational in its witness, and it changes a debate, and it changes us. If we are discussing immigration in the context of knowing and caring for immigrants. It changes our debates about poverty and how to make things better if we are relationally engaged with those who are economically disadvantaged. A few years ago, I was having a conversation with a friend from Georgia. He was telling me about his church and about the after-school tutoring program his church had begun. He told me that his was a very conservative congregation and that most people had very defined views about immigration and undocumented workers. But they started an after-school tutoring program to help low-income kids in their neighborhood with their schoolwork. And he said, to their complete surprise, the after-school program grew like crazy. And before too long, it was filled with hundreds of kids. Each week, they fed those kids and tutored them, and it became a major ministry of their church. Most of the kids lived nearby, and as the members of the congregation started working with the kids, they got to know their families. And they began to love these kids and love their families, and some of those families started coming to church. The complicating factor, however, was that most of these kids were Hispanic or Latino, and many of them were almost certainly undocumented. And my friend told me, we don't know what to do. Most of us believe certain things about immigration, he said, but we also love these kids and their families. And our church is having conversations about justice and politics that we never had before. Now, I think it is safe to say that members of this church have not suddenly ditched their political views, nor should they. And I think it's safe to say that the very real and legitimate questions around immigration don't become any less complicated. But let me ask you this. Where else in America can you find conservative, wall-building, red state Christians worshiping side by side with undocumented immigrants, caring for their kids, helping them graduate from high school so they can go to college, and struggling mightily to work out the politics of that? That only happens in the church. The church is a laboratory for God's political vision. The church is God's agent for change. The church is the place where we strive to embody what we hope the world will one day be. And if we commit ourselves to that, then Christians just might have something distinctive to contribute as citizens. Thank you. You're dismissed.